Responsibility is the very air that nurtures integrity. Let me say it again. Responsibility is the very air that matures integrity. Before I dive into today's discussion on responsibility and how it intersects with integrity, let me just do a brief comparison. One of the things I've found in my interviews when I'm on the street chatting with people in general about integrity, there are some terms that seem interchangeable. One of those, or two of those I should say, are integrity and authenticity. What's the difference? A lot of times as I hear people trying to describe integrity, I hear them really describing what authenticity seems, and I can understand how interchangeable they seem, even though they are quite distinct in the spheres in which they describe. Another one is in relation to our topic today on responsibility. A lot of people would intermix responsibility and accountability. They almost seem interchangeable, but there's actually a difference between responsibility and accountability. Tomorrow we're going to talk more specifically about accountability and how it relates to integrity. But today we're talking about tomorrow we're going to address accountability and how it interrelates with integrity. But today we're going to talk about responsibility specifically. But here is the difference between responsibility and accountability. Responsibility refers to tasks that we commit to or are obligated to take on, whereas accountability refers to the outcome and how we're taking responsibility for the consequences or the outcomes of those actions that we have committed to. Responsibility comes first, accountability comes second. Responsibility, again, is more in relation to the things that we sign up for by way of taking on those tasks. Accountability has to do with the outcome of those tasks and how we're taking responsibility or ownership for the actions and decisions made in the midst of those responsibilities. It isn't possible to have accountability without responsibility. Responsibility is actually baked into the idea of accountability. So you can't hold someone accountable for things that they weren't responsible for, if that makes sense. So I just wanted to differentiate those two at the outset so that we know what we're talking about, and we're going to try to stay specifically on the topic of responsibility today. Tomorrow, like I said, we're going to address accountability, but I want to be careful not to sneak into the accountability territory in our discussion of how integrity and responsibility interrelate with each other. But living with integrity is it's a commitment that one takes, that one steps up to. And so how responsibility interrelates with integrity is that it's a decision that one takes on. When one commits to living with integrity, they're taking on this responsibility. They're stepping up to this decision that they're making where they say, I want to live consistently according to the moral framework that I subscribe to internally, externally through the actions that I take. And that's how the two interrelate. Living with integrity is a decision one steps up to, which is the responsibility factor, especially to one's moral framework that they subscribe to. Now, there are three specific areas I want to address in this conversation on how integrity and responsibility intermix with each other. The first one is this. It's important, especially for us as young men, here I am calling me as one of the young men, and really I'm not, but I'm addressing young men. So let me just include myself just for the sake of this conversation. As young men, we must make wise decisions in life, especially those decisions that are based on our moral framework that we subscribe to. It is important for us to make wise decisions. It's important for us to make commitments in life. The decisions that we make, those decisions, it's really important that they rely on and lean heavily on our moral framework. But for us to even know what kind of decisions we're making, it's especially if they're depending or leaning in on our moral framework or what seems right to us, it's first and foremost important that we should know ourselves well enough to know what is the moral framework that we subscribe to. What is that sense of you should or you shouldn't that makes sense to us that we want to live out of by way of our commitment to? So when we make decisions in life, when we take on responsibility, when we sign up for tasks and decisions that need to be made in our lives as young men, it's really important that we do that based on that inherent moral code that we find compelling. In the absence of doing this, you start making decisions that you're not particularly convicted about. In fact, you may try to subscribe to them and you may try to pursue them even though you don't find internal resonance. And so that leads you further and further away from you being true to your authentic self. But responsibility, especially when it's made with reference to one's ethical code, enables them to walk into their true self and what it means to be them specifically. And this really helps, especially when you are faced with making decisions that challenge your moral convictions. So say there are some decisions that you're faced with that you have to make a call on and you need to choose carefully, but it can be tricky. Knowing what your moral code is that you subscribe to helps you to make those decisions that you're in essence going to be responsible for. Those decisions that you're going to be responsible for and take ownership for, it's really important that you first of all know what your moral moorings are. It requires courage and willingness, especially in certain scenarios where your commitment to your moral code may have you swimming against the tide of popular commitments that you are almost feeling obligated to follow. So say there is a certain course that you think this is the right way I should be going, even though I'm going to be judged for it, even though others are going to think less of me for doing this, I'm still going to do this. One example of that could look like your moral code including that you don't gossip, for example. Now, I know gossiping is rampant and it's something that so many of us do actively on an ongoing basis. But if your moral framework says, no, I believe that participating in gossip is wrong and I choose not to do that, when you're faced with the opportunity to participate in gossip, the decision you're taking responsibility for to say, no, I'm not going to do that, even though there's strong peer pressure to do so, enables you to make that decision that you're taking responsibility for and saying, nope, I don't want anything to do with that and I refuse to participate in that. So there's a courageousness and a willingness to follow your moral framework, especially in making the decisions that are based on your ethical code. So number one, making decisions that are based on values enables you to take responsibility to a new level, especially in a way that is true to yourself, in a way that resonates internally, regardless of the temptations or the challenges that you're faced with, regardless also of the daunting fear factor that some decisions and taking up responsibility inherently have, because you are first and foremost committed to being the best version of you, and you have access to that because you've done an internal sense of knowing who you are. I should have defined integrity to enable us to even know what we're working off of here. So integrity, I simply define as the consistent desire for one to match their internal moral code with their outward actions, with a reference to being true to themselves and respectful of those around them. So that's like the sequential progression of how I understand integrity. Integrity, again, for me is the consistent, that word consistent is really important, desire, that's the motivating factor that comes from within you to match or align your internal ethical code with your external actions from that ethical code that you are subscribing to, with a reference to being true to yourself, that's knowing who you are and what you stand for, and respectful of those around you. You're able to communicate respectfully where your standard lies. So that's all really important factors in my definition of integrity, and that helps bring a bit more light to what it means for one to take responsibility by making decisions that are based on one's moral and ethical framework that they subscribe to. Secondly, is considering the long-term consequences that our decisions have. As we take responsibility in life, young men, as we step into that space of choosing one course over another, one pathway or one trajectory over another one that you have options to, as you take responsibility for those decisions, it's really important, young men, that you start thinking and developing the muscle mind that enables you to think a little further down the line and saying, what are the long-term consequences if I were to take this pathway over this one here? In the absence of doing that, you start making decisions and being responsible for things that have consequences in the long run that you didn't plan for that now compromise your integrity. So part of making responsible decisions that have integrity in mind is considering what are the long-range consequences or impacts that my choices in this present moment are going to have. This helps you to make informed decisions that help you to reflect and align with your internal beliefs, your internal commitments, and your internal convictions. It further enables you to determine if you're able to see these commitments that you're making in this present moment to fruition. Can you see yourself, young man, making these decisions and having enough gas in the tank, as it were, to follow through and finish on the decisions you're presently being faced with? Because when you're able to commit in such a way that has you following through and accomplishing and fulfilling all these commitments, there is honor there. There is credibility that is infused. There is triumph as you're able to be seen as one who follows through and does what they say. Failure to do so, failure to account for the long-range commitments that you have, entails that you aren't going to be seen as credible. In fact, there is dishonor that comes when you are one who says you'll do something but you don't follow through and accomplish on it. So it's really important that you know yourself well enough to say, do I have what it takes to finish what I'm committing myself to? As I take responsibility for doing X, Y, or Z, do I have the integrity to follow through and making sure that I can accomplish what it is that I'm committing myself to? Or is this gonna have me coming up short? This is really important because a lot of our decisions, like I was saying, have an impact on those around us. They impact those around us because a lot of those decisions have other people who are going to be dependent or waiting on us to do our part in following through. Consider, for example, a school project that you may remember doing once upon a time within a group context, a group that comes together to accomplish a task. And so each and every individual within that group is given pieces of the project that they're responsible for. I still remember, even in my experience, when I didn't do my part and I showed up and I didn't have what I committed to following through on, and how that impacted the marks and the overall grade that everyone else got. And so there's that sense that your decisions have an impact on those around you. And so if that is so, if your decisions, if your responsibilities has an impact on the community that you are in, then it's really important that you consider the long-range demands and if you have the ability to follow through on finishing them. So it's really important to choose wisely because of the impacts that your decisions presently have on those around you. It really feeds into this idea that I'm proposing and arguing for, that integrity does not make sense if you're the only person in the world. Integrity only makes sense if you see yourself in the midst of community that you are rubbing shoulders with. One of the things I was mentioning at the outset of this conversation is that many who I've talked with almost mistakenly define integrity with the same way that I would define accountability. And I'd say those two are different. Whereas accountability is more inward focused for a person to know who they truly are according to themselves, integrity also includes not only the internal assessment, but it also includes the external impact that it has on others and how one wants to be able to navigate through life in a way that communicates and says, here's where my lines are and here's how I subscribe to them based on a moral framework that I subscribe to externally. Here's what I think is right, here's what I think is wrong, here's how I'm signing up for that and living my life accordingly. So integrity includes both accountability, but also an additional moral framework that you're binding yourself to, whereas accountability or authenticity specifically has more to do with, I'm just true to myself regardless of any moral framework that one would subscribe to. So consider those long-term consequences that you are subscribing for when you take on responsibilities or make decisions that you have before you. Do you have what it takes to follow through on it? What kind of impact is it going to have on those around you? Finally, be mindful of your limitations. So we've so far talked about how making decisions and taking on responsibility should really be done on the moral framework that you subscribe to, which is part of what integrity entails. Number two, we were talking about how it's really important to consider the long-lasting effects and impacts that your decisions today make, especially on the community that you're rubbing shoulders with. And finally, we're talking about being mindful of your limitations. What are you able to do? What aren't you able to do? When you consider the long-range impacts, what are those things that you have to acknowledge saying, I don't know if I can follow through on this? Sometimes, here's the thing. We make commitments and decisions that as we make them, we feel, yeah, I think I can follow through on this and I can complete on this. However, in the course of life, those commitments and our ability to follow through and completing them change because of factors beyond our control. Say, for example, let me give you an example. In the last year and a bit, I've experienced something I've never experienced in my 4 decades plus of experience, and that is I've never had problems with my back. And in this last year and a bit, in 2 occasions, I put out my back in a most painful fashion that put me out of my ability to follow through on my commitments at work. I'd taken on responsibilities at work. I'd signed off saying, yes, I'm competent. My physical stature is able to follow through on the demands that this job entails. And so as I applied myself to it, I was able to knock it out of the park until I put my back out. And then all of a sudden in that moment, I realized I don't have what it takes to follow through. I made a commitment, I'd taken on a responsibility that I said, yeah, I can do this job. But then all of a sudden factors beyond my control necessitated that I couldn't follow through on it. And so now I had to throw up the white flag and say, I need some help. I can't follow through on this. So it's important to be mindful of your limitations. Sometimes those limitations come unexpectedly where you don't see it coming. You're like, here I am. I have to take responsibility now of making sure that these tasks are going to be looked after and that someone is going to be able to cover for me. Whereas I was once the one who was on point for looking after these commitments, these responsibilities. So based on my example that I shared with you, sometimes things come up in life where you are unable to follow through on those commitments and responsibilities that you've taken on. What does it look like to walk with integrity when you can't follow through on those things that you committed to by way of responsibility? What that looks like, I would suggest, is one, communicating honestly with those that are counting on you and waiting for you based on the fulfillment of these responsibilities that you signed up for. And if that's so, communicating honestly with them saying, hey, something's come up, I can't do this. What is it like, young men, when you take on responsibilities, when you're trying to navigate through this life with integrity? Say you have taken on a space, you have signed on to pay rent for your own space, and you're like, this is responsibility, I can handle this. I have got a job that I can do that enables me to pay for not only the rent, but I can pay for my car, I can pay for food, I can pay for, the luxuries in life. And then all of a sudden something comes along where you're like, I can't work anymore, and now my income is affected and I can't follow through on what I signed up for in my lease to be able to pay for the rent on a monthly basis. I am not making enough anymore. Maybe your rent goes up and you just aren't making enough, and now you have to make some hard calls. You've taken on a responsibility that you can't follow through on because of factors beyond your control. Young men, what does that look like for you to walk with integrity? It means that you're communicating honestly to your landlord and saying, listen, these circumstances are coming into play. When I signed on, I could handle it, but now it's more than what I can fulfill on. I don't have what it takes to follow through on fulfilling these responsibilities I've taken on. And then you're making arrangements saying, is there a way that I can bridge this gap so that these responsibilities are still being taken care of, where I can now work on a plan B on what I can take responsibility for. And this really just demonstrates maturity. It demonstrates a respectfulness to those who you have waiting on you, and also a sense of accountability. Now remember, we're keeping accountability for tomorrow's conversation, so I'm not going to dive into that, but that's also included here as well too. But what does it look like to walk with integrity, young man, when you can't follow through on those commitments that you've signed on for, when you can't fulfill the contractual obligations of the responsibilities you've taken on? There is a way that we can still do this with integrity. You signed on with full good conscience that you're able to follow through on doing everything, but life happens. And when life unexpectedly happens, which it does on an ongoing basis, and I still experience this, what does it look like for us to walk with integrity? It means communicating honestly. It means being courageous and facing the music and saying, here, I have to face the consequences of what this looks like. And that again takes us into tomorrow's conversation on accountability, which we'll save for tomorrow. But those are some of the reflections I have been considering in relation to how responsibility is the very air that nurtures integrity. Why? Number one, because it requires us, if we're committed to pursuing and walking with integrity in our lives, to knowing what our moral compass looks like internally and how we want to see that exemplified in the actions and commitments that we consistently take based on that moral compass. That feeds and weaves right into what responsibilities we say yes to based on that moral compass that we have internally that says, I can sign on for this responsibility because it aligns with my moral framework. Knowing oneself well enough is really important. Secondly, it requires us to consider the long-term consequences and impacts on those around us when we take on those responsibilities. Do we have what it takes? Can we honestly see ourselves following through to completion on these commitments that we're taking on? Do you see how this is the very air that facilitates that integrity, that honesty in the way that we're approaching the world, by one, knowing ourselves well enough and our moral framework and how we're going to make our responsibilities that we sign on for, and can we fulfill on those? And then finally, being aware of our limitations, saying no to responsibilities that you know you can't take on. And if you do take on responsibilities that you in good conscience felt you could fulfill on, what does it look like when life happens and you're not able to do that anymore? How can you learn to courageously communicate with honesty and transparency, saying, look, here's a scenario. I signed up for this in this space, and now it seems like I can't follow through on this anymore. And now you're taking responsibility in a different way and saying, how can I help bridge the gap to see this still being fulfilled, even though I'm not the one who's going to be doing so? Responsibility, the very air that nurtures the integrity that we want to walk with. This is why I say responsibility is a necessary prerequisite for pursuing integrity, because it's inherently baked for those who want to live the life based on integrity. Young men, I am spending time on these prerequisites because once upon a time, I was desperately looking for someone who could help me understand how these interplayed, how I could live and experience integrity in my life in such a way that enabled me to walk with confidence and boldness in my world. For so many young men, I'm talking to you, by the way, because I still know what this is like. I know what it's like when I was trying to figure out what it meant to walk with confidence and boldness, with a sense of self-assurance and self-awareness in life. I didn't have access to any of these beautiful things because I lacked integrity at the very heart of it. And integrity incorporates so many prerequisites that are embaked. I did not know what it was like to walk with integrity, especially by way of the responsibilities that I was signing on for. And I signed on for so many responsibilities that weren't true to me because I did not know my moral framework. I signed on for things that I knew I didn't have the ability to follow through on by way of the long-term consequences. And I burned my credibility in so many ways because I was falling short of a lot of those responsibilities that I signed up for. Knowing what I know now, having the self-awareness and the self-confidence that I longed for once upon a time as a young man, it's in this space that I'm now wanting to reach you, young man. That's why I'm directing these conversations specifically to you, to be able to say there is a way that you can grow in this sense of self-assurance of what it looks like for you to walk with boldness and confidence in what you're about and how you're making decisions in your life and the responsibilities that you're taking on, because you know the sequential development of what it takes to be able to build up that credibility in your life. I lacked it once upon a time. I'd rather you not lack it. I'd rather you grow in this ability to be able to say, this is what it means for me to show up on purpose in my world today. And I think that's so possible for you. And that's why I create these videos, because I really feel strongly about seeing you guys liberated and freed to be able to be courageous and ambitious and strive for more in life. But this only comes when you commit to doing the hard work that I'm describing and paving a pathway for. So if you found some benefit in this conversation, especially in relation of how responsibility interweaves with integrity, how you can be the kind of young man that follows through on the commitments you make in life, I would appreciate you following along, liking this video, because that really helps with getting this message across even to more individuals, more men on this platform who are desperately seeking what you and I once wanted in our lives. And if you haven't subscribed either, take a moment to do so right now. And I hope you'll be a part of this community, because in this community, I am actively cultivating those who resonate with living life with this lens. I want to inspire. I want to challenge. I want to walk alongside you as you and I commit to being men of integrity who inspire others towards integrity. The world doesn't have high expectations for you young men to walk with integrity. I would like to defy that expectation, those low expectations that the world may have of you, and call you to something bigger, something more, something that enhances who you truly are and who you could be. So if I have connected with you, I would love to hear from you. Drop me a comment down below. Let me know some things that you're thinking as you were listening to this conversation. Also, let me know some areas that you feel would be really helpful for me to help your process in relation to what it means to walk with integrity. I would love to hear that. Thanks again for listening. I will see you on the next video. Bye for now.